My name is Daniela. I come from Sintef. So it was very good to see that there is a balance here between research and practice. And we try to bring a little bit of our perspective on practice that we see from the perspective of the researchers. So my name is Daniela. I work together with two other researchers from Brazil. And some of you in this room were interviewed by us. And that's where we take our responses from and what we are going to talk about it today. So it's about communication in DevOps, and then I'm going to tell a little bit of why we started looking at this and what we found. So the agenda is going to be, first, when we started talking with different people that are also in this room, everyone had their different perspective on DevOps. So then we are talking with Jan, and he said, okay, can you bring what you found about what are the different perspectives? And this is what we are going to show a little bit. And then we always saw that people always say communication is a problem. But what is this thing of communication? Everyone always see communication as a black box, but then what we are trying to do in our research is to open this box of communication and try to understand a little bit what does it mean and how to make it better and more effective for teams. Our work is mostly on teamwork, and we work a lot with agile teams and other types of teams, but that is mostly what we work at in our group at Sintef. And then some lessons learned. So then what is our research about? We were thinking of how can two-way communication happen effectively in DevOps teams? So that was the main thing that we were concerned about. We started asking people, this community was one that was very helpful for us, and also in Brazil, because the student I work with, she's also in Brazil, and she works in one of the companies that are sponsoring here. And then we started interviewing people. We interviewed 20 people, healthcare developers and healthcare operations. So then we have kind of a balanced view of how communication can be better done and more effective. So then the first question we had was what's DevOps for you? So then who here thinks that is about cultural shift? Okay. Who here thinks that is about tools? Okay. And who thinks that is about collaboration? Okay. And who agrees with Patrick Debois? Okay. That was little. I thought it was going to be much more. So he sees that as a global company collaboration. So that is his view of DevOps. And then actually what we found out and what we are discussing is that and then I have to ask who thinks that is all above? It's everything else. Okay. So the view that we have is that actually DevOps is not only about tools, it's not only about collaboration, it's not only about the culture, but it's about many different aspects that you can have in the collaboration or in the development as a DevOps team. So it's about collaboration between team members, it's about infrastructure as a code, and it's about automation of the tasks, processes, and workflows, and it's about monitoring. So all these aspects you have to take in consideration when you are doing DevOps. So everyone is right, but at the same time, you cannot have just one-sided view of what the word DevOps means and what the whole thing, the whole process means. So that is where we started looking. So then the point that we started looking a bit more closer is the collaboration part. And for the collaboration to be effective, the communication has to be effective. So we come from the hypothesis that conflicts happens because there are ineffective communication happening on the teams. So then misunderstanding starts to happen, incorrect strategies and mutual feelings of frustration starts to happen. So that is why we started thinking okay, we have to start studying a little bit how communication can be better, and how we put DevOps, devs and ops to work together. And that is how we started with this. So my theory background, then we started taking a look of is there any theory that already can explain a little bit of like how can we do this better? And one of the theories that we found was in channel communications. And then we thought that it helped quite a lot to start seeing some of the aspects that we need to think in communication, so then the effectiveness comes. There are 7 main points. They are about the conditions of the environment. Like, for example, if you are co-located or not, then this creates different environment for communication between the team members. Climate, power, and then frequency, direction, modality, and content. The theory says, and we found that, like also in the interviews that we did, that is true, that if these are kind of like 7 points that like you can take care of and you can be aware of, so then your communication is going to be better. Of course, that doesn't mean that like it's all we need to do. No, but it's already some direction that managers and team members can start thinking about. So then you can get further with better communication, less conflict, and less problems in your team. So then the first one was the structure, and we asked people about like, how do you do your communication? So then if you have a co-located team, and then you ask like, how do you do communications between the dev and ops? They are like, we just talk. So there's not a big deal, right? So it's like, if you are co-located, you don't need to worry about what's the structure of the communication that you're going to do. Because it just happens, You are there, you are in the same room. If something pops up, the developer just go and talks to the operations guy, But if you have co-located teams, you have to think much more. So then you have to think of like, how am I going to do so then the communication is going to flow to these people, right? So then one of the things we noticed quite a lot was that people start working together without never met each other before. And then when we put teams to talk together and meet at least once, they always come afterwards says like, wow, our communication is so much better now that we met. So then putting like this thing of like meeting each other at least once is quite important for the teams. And that really makes a difference on the communication. Then another thing that many of the participants talked about was to have joint chat rooms. So that means that like you have at least a way that like if something pops up, you just go there and fastly type the question or something that idea or some decision that you have made, So it's quite important that you start to think about structuring the way that you're going to talk between devs and ops. And then we also heard a lot about daily stand-ups or weekly meetings. I know that is not always feasible and not all the teams do daily stand-ups. So then you can do weekly meetings, but you have to think of like, okay, from time to time we have to have a venue where we can talk and where devs and ops are going to be discussing things that are happening on the development, Other teams, they have started to have tech talks, tech ops, or showcases. There are different names for this. So then it's about like getting together and talk about specifically just about technology, And then everyone is in the same room. It's very important that you always think about like cross-functional. So then the cross-functional means like you have to have everyone from different expertise together in the same room and talking, So the second point is about climate. Climate it's difficult to define sometimes. Some people think that's about like culture. Some people think that is about like how we bond together. So that is about like how devs and ops bond together. So then you have to think of like how they communicate, how they are supporting each other, how they are like trusting each other. So a lot of things that we heard on the interviews were like, as dev, the ops don't trust us to go to the server and do whatever we want, So then how this is going on, how the trust builds on the team and between developers and operations. Sometimes the ops guy said, it's hard because we never know if they're just like delivering something that's going to break, So then there is all this thing about trust. And then how do you build this climate that they trust each other and they support each other is very important for the communication. Otherwise, it doesn't flow. Then the third point is power. Power is a quite interesting topic, and it was someone said in the presentation before. And it's about like who makes the decision, you know. So then, but then that's not something that like it's always. It cannot be that always the developers have the saying about decisions. If something comes up, then they have to know, the best teams are the ones that have shared leadership. That means that like the ones that are responsible or the ones that have the knowledge to take the decision takes the decision. That doesn't mean that like it's going to be devs or ops. What happens when you have unbalanced power is that, for example, if the developers are always the ones that have the saying and always the ones that have the power, the operations start to not communicating well with the developers, you know, because then it starts to be this like, sometimes there are fights of power, there are problems with like the developers just don't care anymore to say anything to the operations because it doesn't matter their opinion anyways, right? So, or if you have the operations in the other side, taking all the decisions all the time, they don't care about talking to the developers. Why bother, you know? It's just waste of time. So you have to, as like team members, you have to be thinking like, how is the power in our team? You know, how is the power balance in our team? Does everyone have a saying? How does everyone has a voice, independently of what is your role or what are your responsibilities? You know, of course, there are always things like, for example, if you are talking about system architecture, the developers probably have more of the knowledge to say what is going to be the final saying, right? But so then there are topics that you can have this unbalance, but you have to think of like, is it balanced or not overall, you know? And then come some other things that are a little bit easier to understand, like frequency, you know? So then if you have an open channel that everyone can come and communicate, or if it's just like one person that, or like one role that communicates to each other. It's like, for example, if you create silos that just the developers have access to some channels and they are talking about different things there, it's probably going to happen that decisions that the developers make, the operations have no idea what's going on, you know. So it's important that it's open, and it's important that it's always ready, you know. Anytime that something pops up, you come in. So the way that I always think is like, if you were co-located, how would you do things, you know? So then always think of like, if you were together, you would be talking about this on the coffee machine, or you would be talking about this when you just stand up or hear anything. So when you are co-located, for example, operations and developers, even when the developers are discussing something, you overhear something, you know? And the operations can pick up of these things. But if you are not co-located, then it's not so easy. So you always have to think, what do you need to share, you know? And meetings are always a necessary evil. So we always joke because we work with processes in Agile, and we always create new meetings, you know? And then these meetings start to come and come. But there are some things that are necessary, and it's necessary that the developers and operations talk, and they are up to date with everything that is going on the project, so the communication can flow. So the fifth point is about direction. So if you start to see that like the operations are always quiet, nothing, they have never ask anything, they never start communication or anything, it's because something is unbalanced, you know. So then that means that like you can start to think that that's a bad smell, and then it doesn't really sound right, and then you have to think like, why is that going on, you know? So then you can start taking a look a little bit closer to see why it's that operations never ask anything to the developers, you know. It may be another problem with the power thing, or it may be that like there is something on the silos there that's not really working, you know. So we know that like, for example, when there are big launches or changes and so on, there is always much more flow between the developers asking the operations for help and so on. But in general, these have to be balanced somehow. Again, shared leadership and decision making is quite important. And always you have to think that ops needs to be engaged as much as the devs. What we heard a lot about from the ops part was that they said, like, we try to listen. We don't really care about the chats and so on, but you try to listen. If there is something with my name, then I take action. But they are not always super involved with the chat, but it's something that, like, they try to listen to the communication and act when needed, so that is something that is important to be done. But it's important that the ops is a bit more engaged also, and trying to see, for example, if there is a new feature or there is a new architecture that they are going to deliver, that the developers are going to deliver, take a look to see if there is anything that we need to be aware of, that the operations need to be aware of, or it's going to impact in something that you need to alert the developers about it. And then it comes to the modality. And then the modality is another thing that the developers, everyone commented a lot. And we are discussing if, like, is email is still a thing, So then one other researcher that we talked to said, like, if you are communicating through email, that means that you are doomed, because it's not real communication, because it has to be instantaneous, especially when you talk about continuous delivery, continuous deployment, and so on. You cannot wait to see if the person is going to see the email tomorrow, So if you are still communicating through email, it's probably you have a problem, And then, like, these are the tools that, like, mostly everyone was mentioning, different ways of doing it. A lot are using the bots, and then bots is quite a big thing, and it seems to be something that is helping to flow the communication and to make people talk, because then sometimes the bot just, like, pop up with something that everyone looks, and then everyone starts to talk about it, and, like, at least it pops up to something that, like, someone is going to take a look or think about, or at least have the flags on, Yeah. And then it's about content. We say share everything. That means that, like, if you start as a developer thinking, like, should I share this with the operations guy? You probably should. And it's the same thing with the operations. Like, it's better to be safe than sorry. So it's better that you share things and that you talk about things and that you express what are your concerns, for example, as a developer. Share what are your concerns about the environment, if it's going to be something that you may think that may impact, So it's always important to exchange. So when we ask is, like, what do you share with the ops, or what do you share with the devs? These are the things that came up. Exchange of information, technology advices, requests, QA, information gathering, and then when there are critical issues, you have a different chat for, like, hotlines and things like that. But it's very important that each one starts to think, like, in my role, what do I need to share with the other roles, so then we all get together to the goal of delivering faster and better communicating with each other. So what are the major lessons learned we got? We asked also everyone what were the major communication impediments and what were the major communication factors of success. And then these were the ones that came more up. So impediments came as, like, silos. So if you have, like, the developers in their own world and the operations in their own world, that is a major impediment for communication. It's not going to happen. Not sharing knowledge. So that is always something that we need to build with companies that we work with. That is about sharing, like, communities of practice, or communities that, like, you have one specific role talking together, or the two roles talking together, and things like that. So it's important. It's a kind of, like, it doesn't go directly to the work that you are doing, but it helps on the long term for, like, people sharing experiences, sharing technical knowledge, sharing technical expertise, and things like that. Another major communication impediment is about not speaking the same language. So if you have the developers that don't have much experience with what is going to happen when you deploy your system, and you have the operations that, like, have no idea how they developed that, it's hard to talk. So like no matter how much we say like, okay, talk with each other, if I speak Portuguese because I'm Brazilian and you speak Norwegian, it's never going to happen. And not understanding each other's work, that was another point that everyone mentioned. That was like, the problem is that then they don't know what it takes, So then they don't know what it takes for us to do this that they want us to do. So it's not only the operations coming and saying like you need to get better performance, but what does that mean, So when you get into someone's shoes, then it's much better for you to kind of start thinking of like, okay, how can we balance this? And then less frustrations come with the communication, and then things flows much better. Too much control over the environment, that we put a little bit more on the heads of the operations guys, because they are the ones that usually get a little bit more protective about their environment, and they are afraid that things are going to break, right? So then one of the things that we heard quite a lot was like that after they started to put pagers on the developers, so then if something happens during the night and so on, the developer is the one that received the calls, things went way better and way smoothly everywhere because then things didn't break as much, So the developers were more cautious about that definition of done that Jan was talking about. The definition of done is like, it's in production, it is working, It's not, so then this concept of being working and it's not going to break, it gets much more internalized when you are the one that's going to receive the call at 2 a.m., or on the weekends, or when something happens. So that is one strategy some teams are starting to use. And not being clear and objective in the communication, that is also something that came up. So factors of success are usually the opposite, right? So then, but it's funny because the first thing that came was like, be clear and objective, So when you are going to talk with the other one that not always have the same background as you, not always have the same goals as you, and so on, you have to understand how you talk together, So if you have maybe to explain a little bit more of some things that for you are obvious, do it, because it's important that you are clear and you are objective with everyone. Work together. So there are some teams that are saying about like pairing for testing, pairing for deploying, pairing for doing different activities. That helps to like bring closeness between the two roles, and also to understand of like, okay, when like the ops could just be watching and then seeing like, okay, when you are deploying, this is what you're doing, or like when you are operating, this is what you're doing, or monitoring, or so on. Share autonomy and empower people. So commit to the job and the tasks. And so all these things of like working together and coordinating tasks are important for success. And that is also very related to what I was saying about understanding what the other person goes through. That is the empathy towards each other. So understand what it takes to be in operations, understand what it is to be a developer, and get to know that person that you are working with, not only like on the work way, but like face-to-face meetings and getting to know a little bit more of that person is going to help a lot with the communication, So then we come back to our topic. That was like, what is fairy tale or horror story? You may say like, okay, she didn't really talk about fairy tale or horror stories. But when we were talking to people, that's what we asked them. We asked like, can you tell us what is your fairy tale and what is your horror stories about communication, And that is what we are also looking for to get more people to answer our interviews. That is like, can you tell us your fairy tale or your horror stories about communication? So then we can understand a little bit better how this can be done better. So if you could send me an email and then say like, okay, I would like to answer to the interview. It's just 40 minutes. It doesn't take much, but it helps a lot to improve research and improve our understanding on how to make communication better. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.